Hello everyone. So today we'll be talking about chapter 9, which is intelligence and psychological testing. Now, when we talk about psychological testing, how do we really define what is a psychological test? So the way that we define a psychological test is that it's something that is a standardized measure, and we will come to explaining what this means. So it's a standardized measure, right? Of what? Of a sample, right? Of a person's behavior. Now, what does this mean? So let's leave standardized measure for now. Let's talk about what sample of a person's behavior means here, right? What sample of a person's behavior means is that, when you're using a psychological test, right, you cannot make a claim about this whole person in particular just using this psychological instrument that you have, right? What that means is that, there are times, let's say, so for example, one day you wake up and you're not having the best day, and you take a particular quiz, let's say of Psych 100, and you score pretty badly. Let's say you get a score of 2 out of 10, right? Now, this score is only a sample of your behavior, right? What that means is that this is not, something that you do each time, right? This is not something that your behavior looks like all of the time, right? So this is just one example of your behavior, right? Or it's one of the many possible behaviors that could have occurred that particular day, right? So, when we talk about psychological tests, it's extremely important to understand that they only give you, or they only test for a sample of a person's behavior. You cannot make a complete conclusion based on someone's test results, right? So that is what we mean when we say a sample of a person's behavior. What does standardized measure mean? Now, let's talk about what kind of psychological tests there are, and then let's go back to talking about what a standardized measure means, right? Because when we talk about different kinds of tests, I think it will become clearer what we mean in terms of sample of a person's behavior and what a standardized measure looks like, right? So when we talk about psychological tests, right, one of the things that we see is that there are different kinds of psychological tests, right? Now, one of these is what are called intelligence tests. Right? Then we have something called aptitude tests. Right? And furthermore, we have something called achievement tests. Right? And we also have something called personality tests. Now let's go over these one by one. So what exactly are intelligence tests? So intelligence tests, basically, what they check for is general mental ability. What exactly does that mean? I think that will become clearer when we talk about what aptitude tests do. So unlike intelligence tests which check for general mental ability, yes, aptitude tests are more focused. What does that mean? That basically means that aptitude tests check for specific kinds of mental abilities. Now, what specific kinds of mental abilities can there be? Now, when we talk about intelligence, right? intelligence can come in many forms, right? Or when we're checking for intelligence, we can check for it in a variety of ways, right? So, one way that we can check for intelligence is looking at verbal ability. What is verbal ability? So, verbal ability can be that, for example, you're given a passage to read, and then at the end of it, you're given certain questions about the passage. So basically it looks at how well are you able to comprehend, how well are you able to answer questions about something that you've just read, right? So that checks for your verbal ability, right? Then, there's another ability which is called numeric ability. Now, what does numeric ability do? Numeric ability basically checks for how well are you able to manipulate numbers, right? So how well are you able to play around with numbers, right? Now, these are two different kinds of abilities, right? And what aptitude tests do, unlike unlike intelligence tests, is that they look at specific kinds or specific aspects of intelligence, right? So an aptitude test might just look at numeric ability, or it might just look at verbal ability. You have other forms of intelligence as well. So for example, you might have, understanding spatial recognition, right? So that will basically comprise of you manipulating different shapes, right? So if, for example, you're given a particular 3D shape and said you're asked to mentally rotate it 180 degrees and then say, what will this look like if it's rotated 180 degrees, right? So that would be a test for your spatial recognition or your spatial intelligence, right? So an aptitude test would perhaps only focus on one of these aspects, or it could even focus on, 2 or 3, but basically it's looking at different mental abilities as different facets of intelligence, whereas with, more broadly, general intelligence testing, right, you're looking at intelligence in a more general mental ability kind of manner, right? So that's basically the difference between intelligence testing and aptitude testing, that with aptitude testing you're looking at specific kinds of mental ability, whereas in intelligence tests you're looking generally, broadly, at general mental ability, right? I think the AccuPlacer that you guys take when you are seeking admission to FCCU is also an example of an aptitude test, because that is mainly focusing on verbal ability and numeric ability, right? Now, when we talk about achievement testing, so what exactly is achievement testing? Now, if, for example, after watching this video, I ask you to attempt a quiz on Chapter 9, which is Intelligence and Psychological Testing, right? So that is an example of an achievement test, because what I'm looking for mainly is your knowledge or your learning of Chapter 9, right? Of a particular domain, right? So achievement tests basically tap into your knowledge of a particular domain. So if you have, let's say, a history quiz, that will also be an achievement test. If you have a maths quiz, and it's something that you had learned in class, a particular mathematical technique that you had learned in class earlier, so that might also be a test of achievement, right? And this is obviously different from intelligence testing and aptitude tests, right? So this is what achievement tests are about. What about personality tests? So personality tests basically, tap into a variety of things, such as, they can be looking at a person's interests, they can be looking at, what motivates them, right? They could be looking at, let's say, different values that this person might hold, right? Different attitudes that they might hold, right? And after you have answered these questions about, from all of these different areas, personality tests might put you in a particular category of personality, right? So this is basically what personality tests are doing. Now we've talked about different kinds of psychological tests, right? Now we come to talking about what exactly a standardized measure is. And when we talk about standardization. What does that mean in the context of psychological testing? Before we move on to that, so, let's just go back to talking about this when we talked about sample of a person's behavior, right? So when you look at all of these different kinds of tests, what you see is that, let's say someone is taking an aptitude test, right? So let's say you took the FCCU Accuplacer, and that particular evening you woke up fresh, right? You had sort of practiced your mathematics and your English to a certain degree, right? So, that basically will have an influence on how well you do on the test, and therefore, your performance on that test can be said to be a sample of your behavior, right? Let's say you're doing a psychological test, and during, that particular day, you're feeling extremely low, and therefore that influences the sort of responses you're giving to questions, right? And that therefore then influences the personality type that you're put into when you get the result. So that was obviously a sample of your behavior, in the sense that it doesn't represent all of your behavior. It's just a segment of your behavior that was tested by the psychological instrument that you used, and therefore you cannot make any sort of conclusion about how you are as a person. You can say that yes, this is just a segment of your behavior, right? So that's something important to remember. Now we talk about what is standardization, and when we talk about a standardized measure, what exactly does that mean? So when we talk about standardization, right, what we mean by that is that, let's say you take the SAT, right? Now, if you take the SAT in, let's say, Lahore, Pakistan, or you take it in New York City, United States, right? The way that questions are put forth in the SAT, right? How much time you're given for the test, how is the test scored, right? All of that will be standard no matter where you are in the world, right? So, whatever processes or whatever procedures are involved in the test situation, right? And, the scoring of the test, right? All of that is uniform, right? No matter where you are in the world, no matter at what time you take the test, right? No matter whether you take it, let's say, 8 years from now, right? So it will be the procedures that are involved in the test situation and the way that the test is scored will be standard, it will be the same, right? That is what we mean when we say it's a standardized measure, right? Another thing that goes into making, ensuring that a test is standardized is basically, so, if you, let's say, take a particular test, right? And you're basically wanting to test for, you took a personality test that checks for assertiveness, right? And you got a score, let's say, of 25 out of 50, right? So you basically showed an inclination to be assertive on 25 of the items, right? Now, what does this mean, right? This is something that we call the raw score. So basically, this does not really tell you anything about, how you scored, because it just gives you a raw score. Psychological tests, and this is something very, very important to remember, right? All psychological tests, right, are relative. Now, what does this mean? That, whenever you're doing a psychological test and you're getting a result, right, whatever that result is telling you is basically about how you stand in response to or in relation to other people, right? When you get a raw score like this doesn't tell you anything, right? Unless you know that you scored, let's say, more than 80% of people, then you know that yes, you're more assertive than the average person, right? or it tells you something like you're more assertive than, let's say, 25% of the people who took this test, then you know that you're less assertive than the average person, right? So because psychological tests are relative in nature, you need something that are called test norms, right? And test norms are basically developed through standardization. So basically what happens is that when you develop a tool, right, you present it to a group of people, right? You give it to a group of people, and how they do on that, right? How, what sort of scores they get on that, right? They go on to, form what are the test norms, right? And then what that does is that allows you, so, for example, you might develop a particular mean score for assertiveness, and then what that does is that when anyone takes that test next time and they get a raw score, they can use these test norms to convert their raw score into a percentile score, right? Now let's say you had particular test norms, and using those test norms, right, you basically converted this raw score into a percentile. So you converted it into, let's say, you found that you fall on the 85th percentile. Now that really tells you something. That tells you that you scored either as good as or better than 85% of the people who took this test, which means that you are pretty assertive, right? So now this really tells you something. So this process in which you develop a test and then you present it to a group of people and develop test norms from it, right, is also involved in the process of standardization, right? Now there are other certain aspects of testing that we move on to, which are extremely important as well. So when we talk about psychological tests, they need to have these two different constructs that we're going to talk about. One of them is reliability, right? And the other is something that we call validity. Now, what exactly is reliability and what exactly is validity, and why are these important for psychological testing? Now, when you say that you have a friend who's particularly reliable, what do you mean by that? Most of the times, what people mean when they say that they have a friend who's very reliable is that, they can probably almost always, reach out to them, and almost always this person will be supportive, right? It's not that you reach out to them once and they're supportive, but the next time you reach out to them, they're not supportive at all, right? So basically, they're supportive almost all of the times that you reach out to them. What does that mean? That means that they are consistent in their behavior. Does that make sense? Right? So they're consistent in their good behavior, in the sense that whenever you reach out, or 90% of the times, when you reach out, 90% of the times they are supportive. They are there for you, right? So they're reliable because they are consistent, right? How can a test be reliable, right? A test can be reliable if it's consistent, in the sense that, let's say, you take a particular IQ test, right? And you get a score, let's say, of 140, which is, let's say, a raw score, right? And if you convert it into a percentile, this makes something like the 90th percentile, right? Now, you boast about it to your friends, and they say, oh, no, it's not possible. Come on, take it again, and we'll see, right? The next time you take it, you get a raw score, let's say, of 100, right? And you get a percentile of 50%. Now, these two different scores are extremely different, right? What does this tell you about the test? Let's say, you're the same person, you did not change a lot, you had had the same amount of sleep both of these different nights, you had the same amount of food you hadn't done anything very differently, and let's say in the second trial you were not under too much pressure from your friends either. What this tells you about the test is that it is not consistent, right? It is not reliable, right? What does that mean? That basically means that, when you take it once and you take it the next time, the results are extremely different, right? So the reliability of a test is measured by using a method which is called the Test-Retest Method. What you do with this method is that you take a test and you look at the score that you have, and then you take it again, right? And you look at what score you got the second time, right? And you relate the two. What you can do with these is that you can form a correlation coefficient. What exactly is a correlation coefficient? I think we've gone over this previously as well, but a correlation coefficient is the degree to which two different numbers or two different scores are related to one another, right? So let's say when we look at these two different scores here and here, what we see is that the relationship between them seems to be lower, right? So they would have a lower correlation coefficient, right? The degree to which two different variables or two different scores are related, right? So in order for a test to be reliable, right, when you use this method, which is the Test-Retest method, the correlation coefficient between the two different scores that you get in, let's say, so you have a first trial and you have a second trial. So the correlation coefficient between these two different trials, right, should be high. For intelligence tests, it should be, it should look like something like 0.9 or higher, or 0.8 or higher, because when you're using an intelligence test, you're saying something about a person's intelligence, and that's extremely, that's an important sort of verdict that you're giving on the person, and therefore it's important that it has extremely high reliability, right? Now, so reliability is something that's extremely important. You also need something else when you're talking about psychological testing, and that is validity. Now, what exactly is validity? When we talk about validity, we talk about basically that the test is measuring what it claims to measure. Now, what does that mean? Now, if, let's say, I give you a quiz and I say it's for chapter 9, right, which is the chapter on intelligence and psychological testing. But when you open the quiz, you have a nice surprise there, which is that the quiz is actually from the learning chapter, right? Now, what does that do? So I said to you the quiz is from chapter 9, and you open the quiz and it was from, let's say, chapter 6, right? Now, this test which I gave you, does it measure what it claims to measure? I don't think so, right? And therefore, the test that I gave you is not valid, because a test needs to measure what it claims to measure, right? Now, how can this apply for psychological tests? What do you guys think, especially for intelligence tests? So, when we're looking at validity, how do we ensure validity, right? One of the ways that we ensure validity is through something that we call content validity, right? Then we have another way of establishing validity, which is something that we call criterion-related validity, right? And then we have just called construct validity. what exactly is content validity? Content validity is basically when you look at a test and just looking at it, you can see that it's not valid. So, let's go back to the example of how I gave you a quiz for chapter 9 and it actually had items from chapter 6. So just looking at it, you can say this is not a valid test. It doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure or what it claims to measure, right? This is how we check for content validity. How can we check for content validity on a psychological test? So let's say you're measuring intelligence, but actually your test has items that measure personality, some aspect of personality. So your test would not be a valid test. Just looking at it, you can say that the content is not in line with what is being claimed, right? So this sort of validity is sometimes also called, I think, face validity, because you just can look at it and you can see that the test is not valid, right? So this is what content validity is about, right? When you can see that the content is not in line with what is being tested or what is being claimed to be tested, right? So there's no match here, right? It doesn't equate. That's what I was trying to do. Okay, moving on to criterion-related validity. What is criterion-related validity? Now, criterion-related validity is basically that you develop a particular test, right? And you correlate it with another criterion of, let's say, the same ability. And this criterion has to be independent of the test. Now, what does that mean? Now, let's say you develop a test for, let's say, how well a pilot is performing in their training, right? Which is basically looking at how much are they learning. Let's say you want to look at their perceptual speed, how well are they able to make decisions while they're flying, right? So you develop a test which tests for something like that, right? Now, how do you establish that this is the test that you've developed is a valid test, that it's actually measuring what it claims to measure? One of the ways to do that is that you have an independent criterion. So let's say, this pilot, whoever is learning to fly, is learning to fly under a supervisor, right? So the other criterion can be that you look at their supervisor's ratings of them. Right? And then what you do is that the score that you get on this test, right, you correlate it with their supervisor's ratings, right? So you try to establish a relationship between this score and their supervisor's ratings. And you see if the relationship between these is high. So let's say if they're scoring very high on your test and their supervisor is also saying they're doing great, then that means that your test is valid, right? Because it is showing a high degree of relationship between another criterion, right? Another criterion which is independent of the test that you created, right? So basically what this shows is that your test is valid, right? If let's say they scored really high on your test and they were showing that they're doing extremely well on learning how to be a pilot, but they were scoring extremely low with the supervisor's ratings, then that could mean that your test is not valid, right? Does that make sense? Now let's talk about construct validity. What exactly is construct validity? I think construct validity is a more complex sort of topic, and perhaps we need to shift to another page before we start talking about construct validity.